your liabilities in tort law. What all liabilities are there in tort law? Number one is your fault liability. Number two is your strict liability. Number three, absolute liability. Number four, vicarious liability. And last but not the least is your state liability. Now, to understand the importance of all the liabilities as per your exam, your strict liability and your absolute liability usually combined together in a question and extremely important for your exam. Okay? And vicarious liability and state liability usually combined in a question and very important for your exam. And even between them two, in between vicarious liability and state liability, your state liability is very important for your exam. So just understand where your focus has to be. Okay? So we are going to deal with all of them together one by one in detail. We will just break them down. Okay, so liability in tort law, what does it mean? Legal responsibility for one acts or omissions that cause harm to another person. That is your liability in tort. It's your basic definition in tort that a person is liable if they act negligently or they cause some intentional harm. So when we talk about your fault liability, let's talk about fault liability. Fault liability is based on two things. Number one is your negligence, if there is a negligent act, and when there is an intentional harm. This is when we say that there is fault liability arising. So if a driver, he speeds recklessly and hits a pedestrian, that means he is at fault because he acted negligently and he failed to exercise reasonable care. So let's deal with them one by one. Negligence mein what do we mean? See, we are going to code the case laws here also. According to the liability, you remember the case laws accordingly. So when we talk about negligence, we know that failure to exercise reasonable care, where there is a duty to take care, is what causes negligence. Negligence we will deal with another in one class. The whole class will be dedicated to negligence, but here for fault liability we need to understand that it is comprised of two parts, that when there is the person is negligent and the person causes intentional harm is when your fault liability arises. So when we talk about negligence, we come to the case of Donoghue versus Stevenson. Very important case. As soon as we talk of negligence, Donoghue versus Stevenson comes out naturally. What happened in this case? There was a woman, she drank ginger beer with a decomposed snail inside it. And there was no contract between the woman and the manufacturer of. So the court in this case, they held that the manufacturer is negligent and he had a duty of care towards the ultimate consumer. Okay? So this is one case that we will remember, that how did the fault liability arise? Through negligence, which is your Donoghue versus Stevenson case. Now this case itself, it established the duty of care principle. When we deal with negligence in detail, we will write all of this. Now to deal with the negative case, there is one negative case, Blyth versus Birmingham. Blyth versus Birmingham Water Works Company. What happened in this case was that the defendant's water pipes, they burst due to a severe frost and it flooded the plaintiff's property, but the frost was completely unpredictable. So you cannot say that the defendant was negligent. So this is one negative case where it was completely unpredictable. in this case, there was no negligence on the part of the, you cannot say fault liability has arisen. There was frost and his water pipes, they burst and the water affected the plaintiff's property. So this is one positive case where the fault liability arose, and this is one negative case where the fault liability did not arise. Okay. Moving on, we will deal with what intentional wrong. Intentional harm, what does intentional harm mean? When a person causes the harm intentionally, we will say that he has the fault liability arose on his part. So let's deal with one case of this also, Ashton versus Turner. Ashton versus Turner, there was a drunk driver, he crashed a car and he injured a passenger. So the driver was at fault because he intentionally acted recklessly. He got drunk and he started to drive. It's very simple case law to remember for this part of your fault liability. So this is all that is in your fault liability. We will strict liability and absolute liability. Let's understand one thing about these, that when strict liability came in, it gave birth to absolute liability. We will just understand how did that happen. So let's start with strict liability. Strict liability, in which case it was the whole case of strict liability was, principle of strict liability was from Rylands versus Fletcher. Your most important case when you talk about strict liability is Rylands versus Fletcher. This is your 1868 case. So in this case, in this principle, the definition of strict liability is that a person can be held liable even without fault if they engage in hazardous activities and cause harm. But what is the difference between strict liability and your absolute liability? That in strict liability, you can take defenses, but in absolute liability, there are no defenses. Rylands versus Fletcher में what the principles was established, यहाँ पे defendant जो था, he was held liable even without negligence. Okay? So if he brought a dangerous substance onto his land and it escaped, then they are liable for the consequences. We will summarize this in 3 points. To strict liability invoke करने के लिए, to invoke strict liability, we need to understand some essentials. That first, that you have a dangerous substance. You bought a dangerous substance on your land. Second, that there was non-natural use of the land. Escape of this dangerous substance. So these are the 3 essentials that you need to understand, that there was a thing that is very hazardous. Now he had a very big reservoir. He was storing water in very large quantity on his land that was not even permitted. He did not have the defense of statutory authority, and now because of the fault of the contractor who built his reservoir, the water escaped and it harmed the person's land, plaintiff's coal mine. Okay. Now the problem here is that he was not negligent. He was storing a lot of water, but the point is that he was not negligent. He said the contractor was negligent. The contractor who built the reservoir, he was negligent. So it's not my fault. This is what he was saying. Now the court said that even if the contractor was negligent, we will hold you accountable under strict liability. The court formed the principle of strict liability and it laid down these 3 principles, that okay, you were not negligent, your contractor was negligent, but now we will establish the principle of strict liability, which says that you bought a dangerous substance on your land, you did not natural use of your land, and now that dangerous substance escaped from your land. If your case fall under these 3 categories and you are not even negligent, then also you will be held accountable under strict liability principles. In Rylands versus Fletcher, we need to understand that these 3 points, if your case falls under these 3 points, that means your strict liability applies. So after this also, after the court laid down these conditions, it also gave some defenses to the defendant. Now till here we know how strict liability principle will apply. Now there were some defenses also that were given to your defendant. That is the whole point of your difference between strict liability and absolute liability. Now the defenses that are available to the defendant in such a case of strict liability is number 1, that there was plaintiff's consent. These are specific defenses for your strict liability, and when you write an answer for this, you have to give everything about it. Your case law, your essentials, your conditions to meet strict liability principle, and your defenses. So defenses to defendant, number 1 is plaintiff's consent. Number 2 is the act of God, which is your vis major. And number 3, act of a third party. And number 4 is statutory authority. Did we not just study 5 defenses? These are the defenses out of the defenses that we were studying that applies on your strict liability principle. Now how does this apply? The court formed the principle of strict liability in Rylands versus Fletcher, applied it to the facts of the case, and now it said that if the plaintiff's consent was there, before he was building the reservoir, plaintiff consented, okay, you stored large amount of water in your land despite me having a coal mine at my land. Then plaintiff's consent, it will absolve the defendant from strict liability. Strict liability sounds strict, right? You are not going to escape. But in the defenses, in these 4 defenses, we can escape the liability. Act of God, something happened that because of an act of God, the hazardous substance escaped. Okay, there was a hazardous substance. We apply all these things that there was escape, everything. But now because of act of God, hazardous substance escape, then also we can escape strict liability. Okay, some other party came to my land and did a mischievous act and the hazardous substance escape. Strict liability, you can escape in an act of a third party also. In statutory authority, obviously I had the license to keep the reservoir on my land. And if the substance escaped, but I can take the defense of statutory authority. So these 4 defenses you can take in when your principle of strict liability is getting applied to the facts of your case. So this is how the whole sum up of your strict liability is. Okay, understanding this is very important for your exam. I hope you can digest it, and if there is any doubt in understanding the concept, the defense and the whole case, tell me now before we move on to absolute liability. Is this clear, everyone? Simple? Everyone online, I hope this is clear. Okay, nice. So let's talk about a real world example of this. This was your English case. If we talk about the Bhopal gas tragedy case, everyone knows about the Bhopal gas tragedy case, right? Now the Bhopal gas tragedy case, in this, the Union Carbide pesticide plant, right? It was in Bhopal, it leaked which gas? Methyl isocyanate. Everyone has it on the tip of their finger, and a lot of people suffered many injuries, many people died. So strict liability argument, it came in this case. Obviously there is a dangerous substance that they are storing in their company, right? And there was escape of that dangerous substance. They were doing non-natural use of land. So your strict liability principle started coming into play here. They started arguing this, and the company's defense was, they took 2 defenses. They took the defense of act of a third party. They said that there was sabotage. Someone tried to do something because of which the escape was. And next, they take the defense of act of God. ये दोनों defenses the company started taking when the strict liability argument applied to them in this case. Okay. Now the debate was, should they escape liability? they fall within the defenses and they were able to prove it. Do they fall under, should we give them the relief under strict liability here? This was the whole confusion before the Supreme Court in this case. Strict liability principle applies, they have the defenses, they are able to prove this. But what does the Supreme Court do now after thousands of people, they got injured and they lost their lives as well? Okay, this is the case. Now we come about that strict liability principle applies in Indian law. The court said no. Court said no, we will not give you any defense. And the Indian Supreme Court, it formed your principle of absolute liability. So this is how your principle of absolute liability come into birth. It took birth right after, we can see it is coming from your strict liability. Absolute liability, now Indian Supreme Court, it evoluted the principle of absolute liability from strict liability in India. So after the Bhopal gas tragedy case, after thousands of deaths, we said that the defendant here could not escape liability. They said that there will be no loopholes. There are a lot of loopholes in strict liability, and in this case, we will apply the principle of absolute liability. They will not be able to escape it. Okay, despite the defenses, the Supreme Court gave them no relief here. So they introduced the doctrine of absolute liability to remove these defenses. What do you mean? Like, the major difference between your absolute liability versus strict liability is that here you will have no defenses. Okay, here you can take defenses, those 4 defenses can be taken, but here you will get no defenses and you have to bear full responsibility. So what the court said that, how do we define? See, it was defined positively. Absolute liability principle is defined negatively by the court. How is it defined negatively? That if an enterprise, it engages in dangerous or hazardous substances, then it is completely liable even if the harm is caused by number 1, your act of God. Now they are defining it negatively. Next, the harm was caused due to a third party sabotage, and your third, they said the factory took all necessary precautions. You see, they are defining absolute liability negatively here. They are excluding the defenses that if any enterprise it is engaging in hazardous activities, then it is completely liable for any harm, even if the disaster was an act of God. Number 2, that the harm was caused by a third party, there was sabotage or there was external factor, or the factory took all necessary precautions, then also the principle of absolute liability applies if the facts fit. Okay. So this is your case. For this, we will also write one more case when we write this absolute liability. Next case is your Delhi Oleum leak case. That also we will quote. So Bhopal gas tragedy case and Rylands versus Fletcher. This supports your answers for your strict and absolute liability. Your next case that we will also write to support your answer for strict and absolute liability is MC Mehta versus Union of India, 1987. And this is your Oleum gas leak case. Now there was a factory, chemical factory in Delhi affecting the residents nearby and the workers. This was the case, and it followed all the safety measures, and the incident was completely unforeseen, and the company held that they should be protected under strict liability provisions. But the Supreme Court, in this case as well, they rejected all strict liability defenses and they applied absolute liability in this case as well. Okay, so we will support this case law also for your answers. So we can say that absolute liability, it strengthened the whole environmental and industrial laws. here, that now we try to understand how the environment is getting affected by the industries and the whole precautions that the industry should take. They cannot just work around with hazardous substances nearby residential areas. They should take their precautions, because before, when the strict liability was being applied, they could escape liability, but now we will not let them escape the liability after the absolute liability. So there is more accountability. The whole impact of absolute liability principle coming in is that now there is more accountability for the industries. Okay.